Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Dark Dive, the podcast that delves into the depths of the dark web. My name is Aidan Murphy, and I'm your host as each month we take a look at a different aspect of the dark web based on a story that's been in the news. In this episode, we're going to look at one of the biggest stories of the month, the ransomware attack against the National Health Service in the UK, orchestrated by the ransomware group Qilin, or Qilin, depending on how you want to say it. We're going to take that as a starting point to look at the ransomware landscape half a year into 2024, which is fair to say in a very different place to where it was at the beginning of the year. Joining me to discuss the latest groups and trends in the ransomware world, we have two returning guests to the Dark Dive podcast, Joe Honey, threat intelligence engineer at Searchlight Cyber, and a voice that regular listeners will remember from our Dark Web Forums episode. Hello, Joe.
Hi, Aidan.
And Louise Ferrett, senior threat intelligence analyst at Searchlight Cyber, and I believe the most frequent guest on the podcast to date. You can find Louise in episodes on dark web marketplaces, our first ransomware groups episode, and our recent episode on the takedown of Lockbit. Hello again, Louise.
Hi, Aidan.
Before we get into the attack itself, as I said, which is against the National Health Service, or the NHS in the UK, I would like to start by looking at the group behind it. Personally, I'd never heard of Qilin before this news story. Louise, could you tell us a little bit about the group? I think first maybe we should agree how we're going to pronounce their name. So I'm saying Qilin because you told me that's how it should be pronounced. I know not a lot of other news outlets say Qilin, but I think we've agreed on Qilin. Is that right, Louise?
Yeah, that's what I've been trying to do. I've actually been saying it Qilin, so a third option the whole time. Up until yesterday when we decided on pronunciation. But yeah, Qilin, I think the name comes from like a Chinese mythological creature. They have been active since 2022, I believe. They've got over 100 victims listed on their dark website. They are a pretty standard ransomware as a service gang, suspected to be based in Russia, have been observed trying to recruit pen testers, shall we say, so people that can gain access to company systems on dark web forums, usually in Russian, and that's the blurb on them.
So, as you say, I guess a pretty standard ransomware group bio, especially with the kind of suspected to be based out of Russia, and with a kind of typically obscure but quite aggrandizing name. Just, I guess, to put it in context for people listening, so a ransomware group from 2022 with over 100 victims. I guess it's safe to say, again, that's relatively typical. 2022 is kind of quite old for a ransomware group, I would say, and over 100 victims is pretty active. Is that right? Yeah.
So as I've been working in this industry, it does seem like ransomware gangs are sticking around for less and less time. Everything's sort of starting to move quicker. So I would say in the current landscape, being around for 2 years is pretty good innings. They're pretty sort of senior as far as the kind of the ransomware landscape goes. And over 100 victims, yeah. I mean, if you say, this one group has attacked over 100 companies, it sounds pretty big. But I think we have, or I do anyway, have a bit of a kind of skewed perception of what it means to be active when you have groups like Lockbit, for instance, who would sometimes post like 50 victims in one day, or Clop when they go on their kind of sprees and are just dumping hundreds and hundreds of victims in one go. But yeah, I'd say they're, a fairly mid to high activity threat actor.
I guess that might be why I hadn't heard of them before then. So we're talking about, they're going to love this description if they're listening, a mid-table ransomware group. And like you say, not someone who's entered into our kind of top rankings over the last couple of years. Joe, is there anything else that stands out for you about Qilin that you think is relevant?
Yeah, we did that. Not so much about sort of Qilin. We just wanted to pick up on something Lou said just a moment ago. Even though sort of Qilin, however we're pronouncing it, have only been around for 2 years or so, it doesn't necessarily mean, though, that all of the affiliates, all of the threat actors in this group only have 2 years of experience. So Qilin, they're a ransomware as a service group. They have affiliates, they have pen testers, essentially contractors in kind of business terms. And these affiliates, they're not necessarily the most loyal of people as far as I'm aware. So they will change whichever groups that they support. Some perhaps even use different strains of ransomware to try and maximize their own personal earnings. So even though sort of Qilin have only been around for 2 years, some of the ransomware affiliates may have been doing this for 2, 3, 5, 10 times that. So, I think with ransomware groups in particular, you can judge based on the length of service they've been alive, but you do need to be aware that actually, some of these guys may have very, very experienced pen testers kind of working on their behalf and ultimately need to be taken seriously, whether they've been around for 30 days or 30 years.
Yeah, it's a really good point, I think. And I think something that is often underestimated about how affiliates in particular move between these different groups. If people would like to find out more about how ransomware as a service operations function, I would urge you to go back and listen to the original Ransomware Groups podcast we did as part of Series 1, because we go into some depth in there, exactly as Joe is describing here, about how things are more fluid between the groups. Some people often appreciate one in terms of the developers. Many developers go from one group to another, but exactly as Joe is saying, the affiliates may be using one ransomware strain one day and another the next. Has Qilin had any noteworthy victims before the National Health Service, or any kind of specific victimology, a type of organization they target, Louise?
So I was going to mention this actually as another reason why they might have kind of flown under the radar up until now. They don't seem to have a particular victimology, like a particular industry or geographical location that they're particularly keen on attacking. I think, like most ransomware activity, it is skewed in favor of US companies, whether that's down to just the sheer number of companies that exist in the US or a more kind of quasi-political angle, I guess, which might come up again later. No big victims off the top of my head. I would say they don't go for really, really small companies. There's sort of quite a lot of healthcare, a lot of software and IT service companies, a lot of consumer goods and services companies as well.
So that makes sense. That there wasn't a kind of a victim of the, I guess, notoriety of the UK's National Health Service before this.
I should make a point, actually. You have said it was the UK's National Health Service that was the victim a few times now. The actual victim wasn't the NHS itself.
That is a very important point, and I was just going to come to. So, yes, okay, let's talk about the attack itself. So it is important, as Louise was just about to do, to highlight that the attack wasn't directly against the National Health Service or the London hospitals that were impacted, which we'll come to in a second, but actually against a company called Synnovis. I wonder, Joe, maybe if you can give us a little bit of an overview of what happened in the attack, and maybe we can take it from there.
This is very much a supply chain attack. So whilst the National Health Service and huge amounts of hospitals and healthcare providers across London have been impacted by this, it wasn't the National Health Service itself that was attacked. So it was a company called Synnovis. So Synnovis are a very large organisation. They specialise in sort of laboratory testing type services. One of the main parts that's in the news about this was around blood testing. So anyone who was going into a London hospital needed to have certain blood tests run, even just to see was trying to find out what blood they would need in the event of emergency. All of those samples were taken. They were handed to Synnovis, a third-party company. Synnovis would do the tests and then communicate those results electronically back to whichever NHS personal service sort of requested it. There isn't huge amounts of detail so far that we can see in terms of how this happened. So what we know for sure is that late June time, it was around sort of the 20th, if I remember right, they experienced massive kind of IT downtime. And this eventually kind of came out to be ransomware that was caused by Qilin. So obviously this caused instant problems. Testing services failed, people couldn't communicate with each other, they couldn't necessarily communicate with suppliers, and essentially kind of medical services inside London effectively ground to a halt completely certainly for a couple of days. Luckily, we did manage to get on top of that kind of fairly quickly. Well, I say we, the royal we. they spun up extra capacity with other labs elsewhere outside of London. Other companies were brought in, other methods of communicating were happening, but it still caused, a massive impact. Some of the numbers I've seen vary, but, over 1,000 operations were cancelled. Transplants were stopped or kind of moved, although lucky, I think they did manage to move those organs to other recipients. So they weren't kind of wasted, but for the people waiting on those, it was a very big impact. Even down as some planned cesarean sections were cancelled because they couldn't get the blood supplies and such there in case there was a problem. So there was a massive impact to the UK, both financially in terms of the downtime and the loss of healthcare. Huge amounts of kind of personal lives were potentially put at risk, and I think we're still kind of getting to the bottom of the financials. The actual financial cost of this attack is going to take months to kind of come through based on the incident response, all the work that needs to be done for paying for the other services, all of the work that's going to be done hopefully in the future, kind of hardening systems against this type of attack.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Jed. That's a great overview. I mean, I think, and I think we're going to come on to this in a second, but this is just the initial impact of the attack, really, because then we start to get into the ransom itself and the data that was stolen. But as you say, so the impacted hospitals in London were London's King College Hospital, NHS Foundation Trust, and Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust as well, which are, for international listeners, major hospitals. And the National Health Service in the UK has said that this, as exactly as Joe described, had an impact on national blood supplies because obviously London is such a large part of the UK population. I think the latest figures are that 8,000 patient procedures have been disrupted, and I think that's just a number that keeps growing as I understand it. Even now, over a month on from the initial attack, the impact is still being felt. So that was the, I guess, initial development, and then we had the ransom demand of Synnovis. Maybe Louise, you could pick up the story then. What transpired, I guess, after this kind of initial disruption?
Yeah, sure. So I just want to jump back a little bit to when the attack first happened. So that was actually on Monday, the 3rd of June. Synnovis put out the statement about their systems being down. So that just shows you how long it's actually taken for this to play out, and then the recovery, as you both said, is still ongoing. So Monday, 3rd of June, ransomware attack occurred. A few days later, on the 5th of June, Qilin was named as sort of the number one suspect, I believe, by the former head of the National Cybersecurity Centre. Then, for a long time, there was sort of a long period of not much happening, just reports of the disruption coming out. And then on the 19th of June, so a few weeks later, interviews started coming out from Qilin representatives it was a few fairly big outlets. I think the BBC and Bloomberg were a couple of them that these ransomware reps were talking to and kind of aggrandizing their attack. Obviously, it was very impactful. It did cause a lot of problems, but they added some extra sort of flair to it, shall we say, claiming
to the story.
Yeah, exactly. Embellishments is the right word. Claiming that they had used a 0-day, so that's basically an unknown vulnerability in some software. There's sort of zero days till exploitation. They claimed they used a 0-day vulnerability to get access to Synnovis' systems. They also claimed a political motive for the attack, which we should probably explain now. Very unusual for ransomware attacks, not unheard of. There's definitely some groups that will deploy ransomware as a kind of political statement or as almost a wiper, so they're not really interested in even getting any money, they just want to cause disruption. But for these kind of ransomware as a service gangs, it's odd. The primary motive is financial. They want to extort money out of the companies that they've attacked. But in this case, Qilin gave a sort of confused reasoning. It was definitely related to the war in Ukraine, and I think the UK not donating enough kind of like medical equipment, I believe.
To Ukraine?
Yeah, it was up until this point, everyone had sort of assumed that this group was based in Russia. They were now appearing to, again, it was quite vague, but appearing to come out in support of Ukraine. Now, you can argue for all day about whether this was sort of a bait and switch or a way to make them appear more favourable kind of in the eyes of the UK public, because they also put some statements out with sort of a half-hearted apology to all the people that this disruption had affected, and kind of saying, we're not the ones to blame, you know, you should be blaming your leaders. All in all, yeah, a bit confused. But this, again, isn't unheard of with ransomware gangs. They quite often will do kind of press opportunities where it can be seen as a way to bolster their reputation and kind of make them more feared than their peers.
Yeah, I think as you're aware, cyber criminals speaking to the press is one of the topics that I just find kind of endlessly interesting, along with exit scams. So there's quite a lot I want to kind of jump into here. So firstly, like you said, they've made two claims. One, that they used a 0-day, and secondly, that they are politically motivated, that they deliberately targeted Synnovis, knowing that it was going to impact on London hospitals, and that was kind of what was behind the attack. I guess I'd like to get both your takes on what you think of those claims. I mean, obviously, I think for both of them, we can't say for certain whether they're true or not. But Joe, maybe I'm going to be mean and pick on you. What do you make of the claim that they used a 0-day? Like you say, it actually hasn't come to light yet how they did access Synnovis. But is it possible that there was a 0-day involved?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's all speculation at the moment. There hasn't been any official confirmation either way. In terms of them using a 0-day, yes, it's possible. You know, there is so much technology in use by every different business nowadays. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to make sure that everything is 100% secure 100% of the time. That being said, you know, 0 days, I think, are still kind of relatively rare. You know, when we do see proper 0 days, you start seeing stuff like the Go Anywhere incident with Klopp, where you see thousands of victims kind of falling, you know, in a very kind of quick succession. Also, when you look back at kind of the activity from Qilin, they tend to sort of focus on sort of more spear phishing attacks. So they send kind of very well crafted emails, you know, either very well targeted as well. You know, people with sufficient influence or admin rights, that sort of thing inside of an organization. They try and persuade them to download a particular piece of malware. They've got some history of using sort of vulnerable drivers, you know, sending downloads which install these vulnerable drivers, and that then gains them a foothold in the system. They can work out from there. And typically, you know, if you consider that out of every ransomware group, yes, there is probably going to be one or two people who are proper, you know, in-depth penetration testers and can find and exploit and weaponize kind of proper 0 days. The majority of them are probably going to be low to kind of mid-tier in terms of knowledge and skill, so they are going to be more likely to use either simpler means, you know, tools developed by other people. So I think for me, kind of gives a bit more credence into the sort of the spear phishing type angle. But again, you know, they're a ransomware group, they're a criminal. You know, we also need to bear in mind that they are going to be saying as much as they can to try and either draw attention to themselves for kind of marketing purposes. You know, Lockbit, for example, does that very, very well, which is probably why, you know, they attract so many affiliates. But they also not necessarily going to tell the truth, because that's potentially going to give people like us, like law enforcement, more information, more ammunition to ultimately find and kind of catch them. It's an interesting line to walk, being kind of a ransomware group or a ransomware affiliate, because, you know, ultimately you're a criminal, you need to be anonymous, you need to hide in the dark, you know, otherwise it's going to be very, very easy for law enforcement to catch up with you. But also on the ransomware side of things, you need to be visible. You know, you need to be seen as a threat. You need to be taken seriously. You need to be popular, both, you know, to try and make sure that, you know, you attract good quality affiliates, which obviously then going to go on and make you money. But also, you know, if a hacking group that nobody's ever heard of, you know, hacks somebody, if you don't believe that they're a valid threat, it's much less likely you're going to pay any kind of ransom. So they need that publicity, they need that notoriety to try and bolster their reputation and maximize their chances of being paid. So it's an interesting line to walk, and you've got to kind of bear that in mind when you're kind of judging any claims made by these groups.
That was a very well put, in terms of they have a motivation to kind of bolster themselves. Louise, my sense from how you described it is you're also slightly skeptical of these claims that the attack was politically motivated.
Your senses are correct, yes. I agree with what Joe is saying about how these groups do have to walk a line between not getting too much attention that puts them, firmly in the crosshairs of law enforcement, but enough attention so that they have a bit of notoriety, they have a reputation, they have people wanting to join their team, and also, have a level of sort of fear around them that is going to induce more victims to pay the ransom just to get their data back. In terms of the claimed political motivation, it's not 100%. Like, it would be very hard to prove whether this is true or untrue, right? You're ultimately having to take it at someone's word. But if we look at the broader context, look at how Qilin was selecting victims previously and since this attack, there has been sort of no other mentions of, political motivations for their victim choices. Personally, I think the most likely explanation is that they did not select Synnovis as a victim on purpose. In this kind of ransomware as a service ecosystem, you've got so many affiliates bringing access to different systems at once. A lot of the time, they don't really know, what the victim company does. And that can often lead to situations where companies are misidentified on the ransomware gang's own websites. They might see a company name in a document somewhere and say, oh, we've breached this company, put that as the title. It's actually a completely different company that might be a partner or that just happened to have that name somewhere in their files. So I think they didn't select Synnovis on purpose. They didn't expect the level of disruption that this would cause. And after seeing that, there's kind of two things on the group's mind, probably. One, this could get too hot. If I sort of cast my mind back to the Colonial Pipeline attack, I'm sure you guys remember that back in 2021, big oil pipeline on the East Coast, I think, of the United States got completely shut down and caused, so much disruption and such a crisis that the ransomware gang responsible, DarkSide, effectively had to disband because there was too much pressure on them, and the FBI had announced that they were going to be investigating it. So you can, crumble from that kind of pressure, or take the opportunity and try and sort of make the best of it. So bolster your reputation, try and give off a kind of ethical hacker sort of persona, because people generally are a bit more amenable to that than just cold hard, financial gain. But I think the most important thing to look at is how the rest of the ecosystem operates and how Qilin has operated before this point and since this point. I think that does lead you to the conclusion that it's unlikely the attack was politically motivated.
I guess whether it is or wasn't, what is interesting about this incident and about this group is that, like you say, they decided to lean into it, whereas in the past, other groups haven't. So I remember even Lockbit, when hospitals were attacked in the past, would come out and say this is against rules for our affiliates. Unbelievable. Maybe that ransomware groups have rules, but apparently Lockbit did, and kind of apologize. Whereas, like you say, Qilin made the decision to go out, do kind of a media tour, try and position themselves ethically, while also not really being particularly apologetic about the disruption that they had caused to hospitals and, in reality, kind of thousands of people's lives. So it's an interesting development. And then I guess that leads us on to what happened next. So I think it was Qilin themselves who claimed that they had asked for a ransom of $50 million. It wasn't paid. So Louise, what happened next?
So I have only seen it from Qilin directly, I believe, that the ransom amount was 50 million. And yet we can assume that it wasn't paid. I believe there is some kind of sort of policy in place for public sector organizations in the UK, at least, that ransoms shouldn't be paid. Obviously, Synnovis is technically a private company, but day after the press tour, shall we say, that Qilin had done, they presumably wanted to capitalize on that extra attention. They had already posted Synnovis on their dark web leak site on the 19th of June, but with no data. So kind of as a teaser. And then the next day, the 20th of June this year, the post was updated with a link to a Telegram channel. Telegram is just a messaging app where you can have big groups, big channels. It's quite popular in the cybercrime community to disseminate this kind of stolen data. And they uploaded roughly 400 gigabytes of data that was claimed to be Synnovis data. And I think 4 days after that, so the 24th of June, Synnovis did confirm that the data that was published originated from its systems.
So I guess just to put this in perspective, and I know that we have tried to look at some of this data as well, but this is a huge amount of data. They broke it out into 104 archives, what they call archives, of 3.8 gigabytes each. And like you say, put this out over Telegram because that's the limit, as I understand it, on how much data you can put on Telegram at a time. Is that right?
Yeah, it's like a 4 gigabyte limit. You can do more if you buy the premium. This isn't an ad. This just makes the ransomware gang broke. They should invest.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of unbelievable, isn't it? If you're asking for a 50 million ransom and you're not paying for premium Telegram.
Ridiculous.
And I want to say at this point, reports, this isn't our observations, but reports say this data includes patient names, date of birth, and national health service numbers, and descriptions of blood tests. So there is some sensitive patient data in there for sure. In the last episode of the podcast, we were talking about dark web data leaks, and obviously this is another major example. And in that episode, which obviously I encourage people to go back and listen to, we did discuss health data as a particular problem because, like all data sets, once it's out there, it's quite hard to get back. Maybe, Joe, do you have a sense on, I guess, the potential impact of this data being out there? And effectively, as I understand it, anybody can access this, right? They didn't kind of limit who they sold this bill. They didn't sell the data at all. They just made it public. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so. So I mean, that's one of the key things, kind of one of the key tools that ransomware groups sort of try and leverage. So they put that, you know, if the ransom isn't paid, they make the data available to absolutely everybody who wants to view it. So they're kind of relying on this social pressure of, you know, oh my God, my data's out there, you know, to try and force kind of the companies to pay. But then it also does open up lots of other potential avenues for exploitation. So, you know, that could range from another ransomware group or another criminal group of some sort getting hold of that data, finding a weakness or another point of access into Synnovis' systems and going back and attacking the same kind of company again and, you know, almost having another crack at getting a ransom out of them. There's also been examples both from the ransomware groups and from other threat actors who have got hold of sort of PII, personally identifiable information, and PHI, personal health information about, you know, victims who've had their data compromised, and then reaching out to the sort of victims individually and saying, yeah, look, Aidan, I've got all of your information. I know everything there is to know about you. Pay me 50 quid or I'm going to share it all over the dark web or I'm going to sell it to your employer or that sort of stuff. So they just kind of layer kind of extortion, you know, using the same sort of data set. So I haven't seen any instances of this being done with this data set so far. But that being said, yeah, we're only, month, 6 weeks or so kind of post-attack. So if kind of Qilin are planning something like this, they may still be working it. Yeah, another threat actor group may have this data and maybe planning something. Another opportunity, you know, another option is they may have just seen the amount of kind of media coverage and focus that this attack has got and gone, actually, you know what? It's not worth it. I'm going to try and let this one pass, fly under the radar, go back to attacking people who are less likely to kind of get me attacked sort of in return. But I mean, these ransomware groups, they're constantly evolving what they do. You know, when they first kind of started, they would just encrypt all the data and you would pay your ransom, you get your decryptor, and that was it. And that caused enough problems. people started getting wise, started realizing that actually if I pay the ransom, there's no guarantee that I'm getting my money back. So I'm not, my data back, so I'm not going to pay. So the ransomware groups then started exfiltrating the data and threatening to leak it, to so-called double extortion. And then they moved on to triple extortion, where they do, they lock the data, they encrypt your machine, they exfiltrate the data and threaten to leak it. And then they then also threaten to reach out to news, press, customer suppliers, explaining that you've been breached and causing kind of more damage. So, I mean, they're constantly kind of evolving and testing kind of, new methods, new ways of making money. And, in some instances, this reaching out to individuals may have generated some cost. It also may be proven on the ransomware side of things that actually it's just not worth the effort. Whether that's the effort and the time it takes to do that individually, or, all the media attention and stuff that it's going to bring.
Yeah, you've kind of touched on it a little bit, but I did just want to ask about this decision to just leak the data, because like you say, these are financially motivated people, but it seems like a slightly strange end of the story that they would just put this data out there for free. Again, I know we're just completely hypothesizing here, but what could be the potential reasons behind that? I guess one is that they realise they're not going to get the ransom out of Synnovis, so there's no reason to kind of keep hold of the data. But is it also, I guess, maybe a warning to future victims? If we threaten you, we're going to follow through on the threat.
I think that's quite a big part of it. Yeah, having to sort of show that you mean business and that you're not going to ask for a ransom, and then when you don't end up getting paid, just do nothing with the data. And I think it's kind of more impactful to just leak it for free for anyone to access than if they were to come back a few days or a few weeks later and say, we found a buyer and they're gonna buy all your data and do something with it. The idea that your personal data is exposed to potentially millions of people rather than just one person, even if, that one person might be better equipped to exploit that data. I think that's a sort of a more powerful image in kind of victims' eyes. And it's more sort of embarrassing for the victim organization itself, because anyone can get hold of it. So although from the kind of financial motivation perspective, it might seem a bit strange, I think, again, it's one of those kind of PR decisions that gangs have to make to kind of keep their reputation.
There's got to be a consequence, isn't there? If you're hacked and that the result of you not paying the ransom is absolutely nothing, there's nothing bad that's going to happen. Obviously, you're not going to pay the ransom because there is no downside to that. But if you don't pay the ransom and all of your data gets leaked for free, where anybody with a computer can view it, that's the consequence. And who knows, what's in that data set? Who knows what kind of dirty secrets Synnovis may or may not have that they may not want to get out of the world. It's just that kind of pressure. I think there's also like a bit of an honesty thing for me as well. If a ransomware group says they're going to do something, whether it's leak your data, provide you with a decryptor so you can access your systems again, they've got to follow through with that. Because again, same thing, if they don't follow through with either, restoring your systems after you've paid them or not leaking your data, again, it's just going to call their honesty into question. It's just going to start this spiral of, I can't trust ransomware group X. I'm not going to pay them. I'm just going to try and look up for my systems.
I'm not sure if you remember, Aidan, but there's also the kind of GDPR angle that some groups were taking for a bit, of kind of trying to get victim organizations in kind of regulatory trouble by leaking their data on the dark web. So I think that's another kind of level of the kind of potential extortion that they can get away with.
I think that's one of the things that, the ICO here in the UK or, the SEC in the States will kind of consider. So obviously there is going to be some regulatory fallout for Synnovis from this. The extent of it will obviously depend on what the investigation says, but if they can make that kind of fallout bigger, again, that's another lever that the ransomware group can pull to try and maximize their chances of getting paid. We've also seen, I don't know if you've seen any more, Lou, but the only one I remember is Black Cat in end of 2023, I think it was. They actually reported their victim to the SEC because they hadn't disclosed the breach or filed the breach to them in kind of that particular way. So, using that kind of regulatory pressure as well is another driver we're seeing some of these groups start to play with.
Yeah, I would like to, I guess, pivot from this story now into talking about the ransomware landscape as a whole, as I feel like this is This is kind of where the conversation is naturally going at this point. And so far this year, it feels like it's been a little bit of a mixed bag. So, Louise, two months ago, we did a podcast on a very big law enforcement action against Lockbit, who we've discussed at length in this podcast as well, who were the most prolific group and seemed to be severely disrupted by Operation Kronos, this kind of international law enforcement collaboration. But then we have had, this attack, which, to be frank about it, is quite devastating on two fronts: the initial disruption to patients, and then the data that has been leaked. This is a huge question, but Joe, based on your observations, where is the ransomware landscape now? I guess halfway through the year, Joe.
It's a huge question. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can look at it. I mean, ultimately, ransomware is here to stay. It's proven as a way for criminals to make money, and until that possibility of earning money is taken away from them completely, that they're still going to try and do that. I think it's fair to say it's more fragmented, and there's a lot more different groups out there posting. So if we compare kind of like for likes, if we compare 2023 first half of the year, there was, I think, about 46 ransomware groups posting victims. If we compare the same period this year, 2024, we're up to 72% ransomware groups posting new victims. That's over a 50% increase in the number of groups themselves. There could be many different causes behind that. I mean, you mentioned the Lockbit takedown, kind of law enforcement operation earlier. Have affiliates from that lost confidence in Lockbit, banded together with people that they know and trust, and started their own little groups? Yeah, we don't know. Without kind of infiltrating these groups one by one and finding out their motivations, it's going to be very difficult to say. I think it's kind of fair to say it's also getting worse as well. So again, same time period, H1 2023, just under 2,000 victims. I think 1,917 victims were listed on various leak sites. Same half of the year, 2024, 2,879. So again, another massive increase in the number of victims that these groups are posting. That looks bad. It absolutely is. We need to kind of take those numbers with a bit of a pinch of salt, I think. Ransomware groups often lie and exaggerate their claims to make themselves appear more lethal, so to speak. But also there's likely to be victims of ransomware that we don't see on their leak site. So let's take the 2023 numbers, 1,917 victims were posted on ransomware sites. It's probably a fairly safe assumption that they're the only people who didn't pay the ransom. So how many people did pay the ransom, and out of some sense of honesty or whatever it is, the ransomware group didn't post them? It's almost kind of impossible to know, because these victims aren't going to go about calling attention to themselves that they've been hacked. So yes, ultimately it's very much kind of a growing problem that I think is going to stay. The amount of technologies out there at the moment, the amount of access broker posts that we're seeing is kind of increasing. I haven't got any stats on that to hand, but it's proven as a way for criminals to make money, and as long as they can make money from it, they're going to continue doing it, I'm afraid. It's a
pretty devastating picture, I think, especially after some law enforcement wins earlier in the year. Louise, what do you make of those numbers? And I guess do you have the same assessment of where we are at the moment?
It's definitely not going anywhere. Joe's right on that part. It can be disheartening, I guess, because as you mentioned, there was a pretty big law enforcement action against Lockbit earlier in the year, and they took sort of a bit of a novel approach to it, of kind of trying to beat them at their own game almost, turn their leak site into kind of a leak site about the ransomware group themselves, de-anonymizing the administrator, the kind of leader of the operation. I will say that Lockbit, a quick glance at the stats that I kind of maintain, Lockbit do still have the sort of biggest share of victims in the past 3 months, but it has been greatly reduced from the percentage that they used to have of the total. I think it's gone from maybe about 30% to just under 20%. So there has been a reduction in their activity since that operation. But I think one of the things of note sort of in this first half of the year is the fact that there are a lot more groups. Like Joe said, it is more fragmented. There are new groups popping up every couple of days, it seems. But at least sort of once a week, we'll have a new kind of operation pop off on our radar. They don't all stay around for long, obviously. Some can be very flash in the pan, but it does seem like the overall landscape is becoming, more polarized. There's less of kind of a few big core groups that are responsible for the majority of attacks. So if you look back in the early days, it was like Maze. They were kind of like the top dog. Then obviously Lockbit have maintained success for quite a long time. We've had groups like Alfie or Black Cat, which is no longer operating under that name, at least.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this because last year, the groups that we identified at the beginning of this year as having been most active last year were Lockbit, Black Cat, and Clop. Is that still the case? So obviously you just said Black Cat has gone, Lockbit is diminished. Or what about Clop? Not heard from Clop for a while.
So Clop are quite an interesting one. They don't tend to operate like a lot of the groups that we track. So most of the groups we track, it's a near constant kind of onslaught of new victims and data being leaked. Clop do seem to go through periods of hibernation almost, where they won't post anything for quite a long time. The last maybe 2 or 3 times they've sort of come back on the scene and dumped a load of victims, it has been those supply chain attacks. So I think Excellion file transfer was one of them, the Go Anywhere bug. So yeah, they haven't been kind of seen from on the dark web side anyway for a while. But as Joe mentioned, there's a lot of ransomware victims that we won't see because they simply don't get posted.
Do we have a sense of who the big players are in the first half of this year then, who had the most victims?
Yep, so there is a couple of names of kind of more established groups, so groups that have been around for a couple of years. Black Basta, they've been about for a while and have a lot of sort of custom tools that they use and even lease out to other threat actors. Play as well, another sort of very consistently active ransomware operation. I think they claim not to be a ransomware as a service, so they claim to be a closed group, so a bit more selective. But then we've also got newer groups like Ransom Hub, 8base, even Ink Ransom, Akira. So there are definitely some kind of newer players that are posting really rapidly and getting those numbers up to the level of sort of the more established crews.
And I guess I might just call out at this point, so that the reason that we bring these groups up, and I think the reason we talk about this, even though, as you mentioned, Joe, the problem isn't going away and there are challenges, but I guess keeping track of who these big players are, who the most prominent groups are, and incidents, for example, like the Qilin incident against Synnovis, there are things organizations can do if they kind of collect this data, if they continuously assess, right? So it is, it's not just a case of ransomware is always going to be a problem. Let's bury our heads in the sand. The reason we continue talking about this is because there are things organizations can do.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we look at it from kind of a law enforcement side of things, if you look at it on the surface, they attacked Logbit, they took down loads of their infrastructure, but Logbit is still around and still kind of posting victims. But on the law enforcement side, they've made a big difference to anyone that was ransomed by Logbit and got their data back, got a decryptor. They've made it more difficult for Logbit to operate. They're potentially, that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing so many kind of new ransom groups pop up, is that law enforcement are getting very good at kind of locking down and disrupting some of these bigger groups. So they're having to fragment, having to become this sort of smaller organizations. But yeah, on the enterprise side of things, putting your head in the sand is probably the worst thing that you could do. Cybersecurity is never a guarantee, but we've still got to kind of try and do it right. But if you look at a lot of the attacks and kind of how they operate, if you're doing the basics of security well, you're massively going to reduce your risk of getting attacked. So, anything from using like 2FA, if an access is gained, is it sold? If you can put 2FA in place, especially for admin credentials, making any big changes to the system, anything like that, that's going to make it massively more difficult for a ransomware group to successfully execute an attack. Not impossible, but a lot harder. And the harder we can make these kind of things, the much higher chance we've got the ransomware group going, you know what, I could spend 6 weeks trying to hack company X, or I could pop next door to company Y and be in and out within a week. So I'm going to put my time where I'm more likely to get money. One of the other massive things to try and combat ransomware is just around backups. A major kind of part of a ransomware attack is making your systems inoperable, making your data inaccessible. If all of your data is backed up and stored safely, securely, off-site, offline, then you can just restore your latest backup before the ransomware group kind of got in there. And there you go. You've mitigated a massive chunk of damage that these guys are going to cause. And obviously, we do need to beat that old drum as well, but around patching, as soon as a vulnerability is discovered in a key system, patch it, deploy that update. Yes, it might cause a bit of a headache for the security team. Yes, you might have to look at other sort of bits of software or systems that depend on that system that you're patching. But the sooner we can close these potential points of entry into a system, the less likely they are for a ransomware group to do it. If you look at kind of any of the sort of the cybersecurity organizations in your jurisdiction, so sort of CISA in the USA, the NCSC here in the UK, for example, if you can put ransomware into their site, they've all got really good guides in terms of the best practice and basic to try and minimize the risk of that. And it all comes down to things like good authentication, least privilege, backing your data up regularly. Certainly something we'd encourage to have a good read through those and try and apply many of those controls as you can.
And I think as we've discussed today, these tactics are always changing as well. And the way that different ransomware groups approach things is changing. So I think that's why as well, kind of keeping on top of these intelligence trends is important. Which brings me, I think, to kind of my wrap-up question. So Joe, you mentioned that there's a lot of new groups that have emerged this year. I might ask each of you, is there maybe, if we just look at one new group each that you think is particularly interesting, or our listeners probably won't have heard of before, that they should be aware of? Louise, maybe I'm gonna pick on you first. Is there a group that kind of catches your eye as one that's emerged in 2024?
I knew that was coming. I've been far too lucky so far. Joe getting picked on first.
Got to be even-handed.
That's an excellent question. I would say Ransom Hub is kind of interesting from a genealogy perspective. I'm fairly certain it was Ransom Hub anyway, but I believe they kind of sprung up in the wake of the Alfie attack against Change Healthcare, kind of the story of a disgruntled affiliate who didn't get paid their chunk of the ransom that was secured from Change Healthcare and kind of span off on their own group. Obviously, Alfie famously had some run-ins with the FBI, I believe. US law enforcement in some capacity shut down their site. They brought it back online. Then they claimed that another law enforcement operation had been done against them, and that's why they were shutting down. Law enforcement then came out and said, we don't have anything to do with this one. So it's kind of an interesting exit scam by a ransomware group. We love exit scams, Aidan. But it's typically on the kind of market side of things, rather than this kind of niche.
So you're saying Ransom Hub was in some way affiliated with Black Cat / Alfie, and now since they've disappeared, Ransom Hub have taken the reins?
It's allegedly a former affiliate of Alfie. Yeah, I should state none of this is definite, but I guess I just find it interesting, kind of like what Joe was talking about at the beginning, that sort of evolution of affiliates just, jumping around to different groups. I've been obsessed in the past with like particular affiliates that worked with Conti, and then they went to Lockbit, and then they'd set up their own gang, and it's just, I find that personally very interesting to trace. But Ransom Hub also is just a pretty competent operation. They're pretty active, and that's why I think they're one to be aware of.
One to watch. You said they were one of the most prolific this year so far, right?
Yep. And for the last 3 months, they appear to be second after Lockbit in terms of number of victims.
So definitely one to, considering they just emerged this year, definitely one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, definitely look into what their kind of indicators and TTPs are and how you can defend against those and detect them.
And Joe, how about you? Is there a particular group you want to call out? You've had a little bit more time to have a think about it than Louise.
I think kind of the interesting one that I'm going to try and pay attention to is a group called APT73. So in terms of when you look at this particular group and who they target, it seems to tie in very nicely with we'll target anyone that we can make money from, wherever they can get access. So there isn't really any trends so far that I've seen in terms of the victims, the industries of the victims or the locations. The interesting one for me is it looks as if they're an offshoot of Lockbit. Obviously, to be confirmed, we can't kind of guarantee any of this. But if you look at compare the leak sites side by side, there's a lot of similarities there. Whether that's because there's the same people behind it or whether they've just looked at Lockbit and gone, you know what, that works, I'm going to copy that. We don't know. The other interesting one is around their name. So I'm sure most of the listeners will be aware, but obviously APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, is a naming convention that's used by Mandiant, and it's used to basically they will name a group an APT once they're kind of confident they are actually a valid, persistent kind of threat, an advanced persistent threat. So the fact that they've given themselves the APT73 name is really interesting. Is it a marketing ploy? Are they just trying to pick up more kind of news coverage and stuff by using the APT name? Is it an ego thing? Are these guys essentially trying to say, we are the best ransomware group out there. We've just kind of gone ahead and named ourselves an advanced persistent threat just to save you the time. It's a really interesting kind of psychology, marketing sort of question that be interesting to see what these guys do, how much they post, and what comes off the back of it.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up APT73 because I find that the naming convention thing really interesting. And like you say, yes, that's Mandiant's, standardized naming. APT usually applies to state-backed groups. And I mean, again, usually we should say ransomware groups aren't state-backed. They're financially motivated, so they wouldn't even be an APT, but it does seem to be like a way to bolster their own credibility, which is obviously something we've talked quite a lot about in this episode. Really interestingly, I saw earlier this week another ransomware group whose name I think you pronounced sexy, as in SEXI, ransomware, have rebranded as APT Inc. So it seems to be a trend to be kind of claiming this APT branding at the moment. So definitely something to keep an eye on.
I mean, ultimately, these ransomware groups are essentially businesses. They have contractors working for them doing the damage, but they also have leaders. They have people taking care of finances, people taking care of marketing, people taking care of, customer support almost and kind of handling all those negotiations. And, if you compare their business with ours, any business that doesn't evolve, doesn't improve its products, doesn't change, will eventually go out of business or will be beaten by someone that does. So it's kind of quite natural that they're evolving their methods in response to everything that we do on the law enforcement side and the press, PR, media side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note, keep an eye on Ransom Hub, APT73, and of course Qilin, who have proved themselves to be a formidable ransomware group. I'm going to draw a line under this episode of The Dark Dive. A big thank you to Louise and Joe for joining me. And if you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on the podcast, please feel free to get in touch through our email address or the social media accounts that you can find in the show notes. And if you can't wait to find out more, remember you can follow us for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast app you use, and get all of the episodes in The Dark Dive as soon as they are released. Until next time, stay safe.